I just have to say this. This was the weirdest thing. I'm sitting in the front. I'm sure this will happen on many occasions. As many of you know, I am a new father, 6-month-old, sitting in the back with my wife. And I've never been in a room where there are multiple children making noises before, and was immediately able to pick up his noise. And that was bizarre. I've never experienced that before. I was like, oh, that's my kid. Wait, is it? And I had to look back. It is. Yes. Score one for the father gene there. The mothers get all the credit for having the cool genes. Anyway, so this week we are going to be closing out our time in Torah, believe it or not. And that means it's been 11 months, which is really crazy for me, especially since I was the one who opened up this series. I don't know if you all remember, but Curtis was gone the week after Christmas, and I preached kind of the intro where I tried to convince you all that this was a good idea. And in doing so, if you remember, I brought up Paul and his understanding of the Torah before and after he encountered Jesus, the Messiah. And I kind of suggested that Paul thought the Torah was good, which I'm pretty sure he clearly says in many places, but that his intentions had somehow been corrupted, so that even though he was trying to do the will of God through the Torah, he found himself using the Torah to do something of his own will, and that was the problem. The Torah wasn't the problem, it was his own corrupted will. And so he could even say to his audience, I am blameless according to the Torah, yet I have done nothing that God would want me to do, which is a bizarre thing to think. He's convinced that the only corrective for this is to have your will transformed by the Holy Spirit. This is what I think Jesus was getting at in chapter 16 of John. So what I was trying to convey in that first message was this idea that while Paul found himself doing something other than the will of God with the Torah, that didn't mean that he could only do the will of God without it now. He needed that as his grounding place before he could begin this new journey that he was on to do the will of God. And so I urged you, as we all entered into this season of Torah-ness, that these 5 books might actually be helpful in grounding us into God's intentions, so that coupled with the Holy Spirit might lead us into faithfulness. And so I want you to think as I speak, you can kind of tune me in and out if you want to, reflect on how you felt about the Torah while we were going through this. Were you open but skeptical? Did you just ignore it because you had decided beforehand, it's probably not that useful? Or did you read it despite its sometimes confusing content? I think I'm somewhere on all of these, so if you're on all of them, that's fine too. Or did you actually let it reshape some of your ideas about who you think God is? I think I can say with a fair amount of certainty on behalf of the board, I don't want to speak for all of you, but I think it played a fairly significant role as we discussed kind of our mission, our core values, and what we called our preferred cultural values. As we developed those this year, I think the Torah really had an important part to play in that conversation. And just let me kind of elaborate on those, because I know we talk about them a lot, so I'm just going to keep talking about them more so that we have them kind of in front of us. First is our mission statement: sending disciple-making communities into the world. Now, I'm not going to explain exactly what all those words mean. That's for a January meeting that we're going to have that you're all probably going to get an invitation to at some point. But this statement is our purpose for existence. This is why we exist, to send out communities that can make disciples in our world. The second category are our core values, and there are 4 of them: faithfulness, community, discipleship, and hospitality. These are the nucleus of who we are as a people. If this is who we are, we will be able to accomplish our purpose. Okay? So, our why: sending disciple-making communities into the world. What that looks like on the ground: a faithful community that values discipleship and hospitality. Then there are 6 specific attributes. I know this kind of gets complicated, but I want you to stick with me, that we think will appear as we engage in this kind of activity, when we make our purpose clear. We will be a community that values hope in the resurrection. We will be a community that values spiritual growth, that values mission, partnership, empowerment, and finally, truth-telling. This is what our community will begin to look like, the values that we will show to others as they come through our doors. And the last of these values, truth-telling, this wasn't just like a, hey, I want you guys to know this. Truth-telling is going to play an important role in our investigation of the final piece of the Torah this morning. So I want you to just keep that in mind. Truth-telling, cultural value that is exhibited in a faithful community that values discipleship and hospitality. You got all that, right? I'm sure you wrote it down. Yeah. So, got it. I'll ask you to repeat it to me as you walk out the door. Pop quiz. So, regardless of your disposition toward Torah when the year began, I hope that you were able at least to hear these instructions of God that were given to Israel and recognize the grace in these words. I know that sometimes that's hard to see, but I hope you saw it. Because if nothing else, reading through the Torah can be a test of perseverance and character. It forces us to come to grips with how important Scripture actually is to us, because it's often very difficult to read. And this is an extremely important point that I want you to hear. The Torah reveals God's character. As much as we may like or dislike it, this is our God. So in short, resistance to these texts might reveal a little bit about how you feel about God. Just something to think about. And to throw us all in the pool together, I think we all struggle with hearing the truth. And this is what this text is trying to convey to us, the truth. So, are we going to be stubborn and rebellious toward it, or are we going to understand that we struggle with it and we need to embrace it? That's the question that we're going to grapple with today as we read the last 4 chapters of Deuteronomy. So, in order to do that, I want you to picture with me a shelf filled with books. Those of you who are in my small group got a little glimpse of this, so don't give away the punchline. Okay? Picture a shelf of books, and imagine that each one of those books is a section of Deuteronomy, chapter 4 through chapter 30. So this is like a long, sprawling set of instructions, and they're each in their own individual volumes on the shelf. Now, envision 2 ornate as you can possibly think, bookends holding the books together. Okay? That is Deuteronomy 1 through 3, very beginning, ornate bookend, and Deuteronomy 31 through 34. For me, I guess it's this and this for you. I don't do reverse images here. So when I was thinking of this, I don't know if you guys had anything like this when you were a kid, but we had these bookends at my house that depicted a scene from Winnie the Pooh. And they were ceramic, and they were definitely made in the 80s. That's clear. I wish I had a picture to show you. They're quite funny. But the scene that it depicted is Winnie the Pooh stuck in the rabbit hole, right? And Rabbit's trying to push him through on one side, and Christopher Robin's trying to pull him out on the other side, right? And so when you put them together, and there are no books in between them, you get this funny little scene, right? But when you pull them apart, they can hold books together. The scene's still there, right? But there are a bunch of books in between. This, I think, is exactly what Deuteronomy 1 through 3 and 31 through 34 are. They're a consistent and coherent story that's being told, that's being interrupted by a bunch of instructions. So what I want to suggest is that if we really want to understand what the instructions in the law were trying to tell the people of Israel, we need to know what that story is consistently. In other words, we need to take chapters 4 through 30 out for a little while and just look at the story as a whole before we can decide what exactly was Moses trying to say to the people of Israel to get them to hear the Torah well. So, in order to facilitate this, we're going to remove the in-betweens. So I'm going to read to you the very end. I'm not going to read to you 1 through 3. don't start leaving yet. I'm going to read the very end of chapter 3 and then transition immediately into chapter 31 so you can hear how it just goes right into the other, okay? So I'm going to start in chapter 3, verse 21, and if you want to like put your finger in 31 just so you can kind of flip really quickly, I'll give you warning, but it's going to happen quickly because I don't want to lose the train of thought. So starting in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 21. At that time, I, Moses, commanded Joshua, "You have seen with your own eyes all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings," speaking of Sihon and Og, just in case you were wondering. "The Lord will do the same to all the kingdoms over there where you are going. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God himself will fight for you." At that time, I, Moses, pleaded with the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and the mighty works you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country, and Lebanon." It's such a great little speech from Moses. "But because of you," Moses is now addressing the Israelites, "the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. That is enough," the Lord said. "Do not speak to me any more about this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and look west and north and south and east. Look at the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead this people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see." So we stayed in the valley near Beth Peor. And then jumping to chapter 31. Then Moses went out and spoke these words to Israel. "I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, 'You shall not cross the Jordan.'" Yes, he did. He just did, if you skip all those chapters. "The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and he will take possession of their land. And you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord has said. And the Lord will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og," those two kings that we mentioned at the end of chapter 3, "the kings of the Amorites whom he destroyed along with their land. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." So, if you imagine my Winnie the Pooh bookends, with no intervening books, do you see how these distant pieces kind of form a seamless transition? It's actually pretty remarkable to compose a story in this way. But I think this is why it's so important. When we look at this story without the intervening instructions, we catch a clear picture of this story that's happening behind the scenes of this grand sermon. And that is, interestingly, the succession of Joshua as the leader and kind of deposing Moses as they begin to go into the land. It's kind of a tragic story, to be honest, especially to frame these instructions, which are supposed to be the hope of Israel, right? But I think there's an interesting and important truth underneath it all that these Israelites are being called to hear as they listen to Moses. It's their own stubbornness that put Moses in this unenviable position. And God is now forced, this is my interpretation, God is now forced to appoint a new leader if these stubborn Israelites will have any hope of actually marching into the land with any success. So as much as Moses uses the opportunity of Joshua's commissioning ceremony to inform the people of the reason for this ceremony, at the same time, I think this is what he's trying to say. God needs to appease their stubborn disobedience and distrust. What's the best way to do it? Fine, I'll give you a new leader. If you're not going to follow Moses faithfully, maybe you'll follow Joshua faithfully. So this is the question I think we need to ask, if that's really what's going on in these bookends as we read them side by side. Will a new leader really change the hearts of these stubborn Israelites? Or are they prone to just repeat this same distrust over and over again? Don't want to answer that quite yet. We'll get to that, but I want you to hold on to that question because I think we all know the answer, but let's not just say it out loud. Be shameful to the Israelites. So let's move on now to what I think is the second interesting part of this closing section. But we're going to do it from the perspective of now pulling these stories back apart and allowing the volumes of the instructions to sit between them. So in other words, we're just going to look at how they function to highlight what we're hearing in the Torah. And in order to do that, I think a good place to go in these final words of Moses is the song that he is instructed to compose, which, I don't know, is this a song for the commissioning of Joshua? If so, it's quite depressing. But I want to read to you chapter 31, verses 24 through 29, where we're kind of given the reason why this is happening. So chapter 31, beginning in verse 24. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law, so chapters 40 through 30, I think, is what we're meant to hear there. Sorry, I lost my place. There it is, from beginning to end. He gave this command to the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. For I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. Remember, this is after the commissioning of Joshua. If you have been rebellious against the Lord while I am still alive and with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? Assemble before me all the elders of your tribes and all your officials so that I can speak these words in their hearing and call the heavens and the earth to testify against them. For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and to turn from the way I have commanded you. In the days to come, disaster will fall on you because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord and arouse his anger by what your hands have made. That's how confident Moses is in this plan. Woo! So, if the purpose of framing the instructions with the commissioning of Joshua was to inspire new confidence and faithfulness in Israel, then why does Moses seem to think it has no hope of long-term success? While it may, and indeed does, I think, give this generation in particular a burst of trust, they do actually go in and take the land, right? In the long run, it ultimately does not have any long-term ramifications. They remain just as unfaithful after Joshua as they were with Moses. So Moses writes these instructions in a book as a witness against Israel because of their forecasted stubbornness and rebelliousness. And as a way of confirming Moses' suspicions, God even commands him, it's almost as though God is saying, yeah, you're probably right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to compose a song. Right? And I'm not going to read you the whole song. It's like 60 some odd verses, like verses in a Bible, not verses in a song, which is confusing now that I say it out loud. But I think this sums up the general ambiance fairly well. God has encircled Israel with faithfulness, and Israel has embraced it, I think, as long as it seemed to benefit them anyway. But at the first sign of trouble, God's faithfulness is cast aside because they're inclined to seek to satisfy their own needs in other ways. And in particular, I want to quote to you chapter 32, verses 28 and 29. This is right in the middle of the song. I think it sums up God's diagnosis of Israel fairly well. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end. In other words, how unfaithful they're going to be in the near future. So, with all this in mind, I think it begs a new question for us. Can Torah, the instructions of God, be anything other than a witness against us? If, as Curtis has been suggesting throughout Deuteronomy, these laws and instructions were made up of concessions given to a stubborn and unfaithful people, then to some extent I think perhaps that is all they can be, is a witness against us. But I do think there's a wisdom underlying the words. It's not as though God is just saying, oh, fine, just do all these things if you can do them. I don't really care. I think there is a general wisdom behind what God has asked them to do, a general way of being faithful if they are obeying these commands. So, what is this law for humanity? What is its intention for humanity? And is a person dedicated to living in a manner like this pleasing to God? Or is there something else that's necessary in order for Torah to become a word not just against us, but perhaps even for us on our behalf? Is that possible? I think if we engage that question honestly, it has to do with how we respond to truth. Are we willing to let the words that are in this law, this truth that is being spoken to us, are we allowing them to penetrate who we are, to critique who we are without saying, yeah, I see that you're condemning me, but it really doesn't matter? Then it's a word against us. And this is constantly how Israel responds to it. However, if we respond to it with humility, saying, yeah, it is condemning me, and maybe I don't understand why it wants me to do something else, but maybe I should, then it can become, I think, a word for us. So, God's instructions speak the truth to us. This truth has, I think, the potential to confirm or deny who we are as people and what we are trying to accomplish in our lives. But when it denies us in our actions as unfaithful, we need to think about how we are responding. If we respond by repenting, then it is a word for us. If we respond by being stubborn, it's a word against us. And so, we move on to probably the most depressing piece of this final section. I'm going to give away the ending. Moses dies at the end. So, sorry. Yeah, sorry. It's rough to hear, especially if you're convinced that Moses wrote the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy. Sorry, Moses. Apparently that made him angry. So I just want to read, it's a fairly short chapter. I want you to read it. I want you to hear it and hear, I think, kind of the depressing desperation in this chapter. So chapter 34, starting at verse 1. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, which we've already been told is where he's going to die, which is across from Jericho, where the story will pick up in Joshua. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea. If you haven't seen a map of Israel, this is like Legolas, what do your elf eyes see kind of vision. I don't know how he looked all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It's pretty. And yes, that was a Lord of the Rings reference, and it's not written in my sermon. Just came to me in a dream. So, as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar, which ties us back into Genesis with Lot. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Because Joshua said it now? Interesting. But this is even more interesting. Since then, No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses. Sorry, Joshua, even though we just said how great you are. Let us finish that statement by saying you're not as good as Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. The end. Perhaps this story stands as a judgment on Israel. Their stubbornness and rebelliousness has resulted in the rejection of Moses for another leader that will inspire them, even though his vision and his strength were still intact. You almost get the idea that he's like put to death there in order for Israel to move on from him. It's really strange. But how long will Israel's faithfulness because of Joshua last? Moses' death at the end of the book is more than just a fitting end, I think, to a long story. It's a reminder of the price that was paid in order for the Israelites to have a real hope of faithfulness right then. Does that sound familiar to you? As you read the final words of Jesus and as they were read here in our service this week, you might also have considered what it would then cost Jesus in order for his disciples to fully embrace and understand the kingdom they had joined. So, what can we say about all this for us, Discovery, at this time? How does it affect us at all? I want to leave you with a few, I think, important thoughts. They might be unimportant, I don't know, you can decide, to consider as we move forward with our mission as a church and as we approach Advent in these next 4 weeks, the celebration of the arrival of the Messiah. The truth is a difficult thing to hear. I think we can all agree to that. It's also a difficult thing to express in words. So when we say that one of the 6 most important values that we express here at Discovery is truth-telling, I think it's a pretty tall order. It's a lot to aspire to. The fact is, none of us want to hear the truth because it's often a witness against us and not a witness on our behalf. The instructions found in Deuteronomy 4 through 30 spoke the truth against Israel, calling them to acknowledge how they were prone to stubbornness, rebelliousness, and ultimately infidelity to their relationship with God. So knowing this, I think Moses framed his instructions with the story of Joshua's commissioning and the Song of Stubbornness, which I have now dubbed it, because I think it's catchy and alliterative, to give the Israelites an open opportunity to reflect on their propensities towards stubbornness. Let me explain. I already told David I was going to do this, but this is hypothetical. This isn't actually something that we've talked about. So if I say to David, David, it offends me that you drive over the speed limit. How do you think he's going to respond? Do you think he's going to say, well, I mean, Derek is my associate pastor. I guess he probably has my best interests at heart, so maybe I should just drive the speed limit from now on. Probably not, right? He's probably going to say something more like, thank you for your opinion. I don't care. Man, apparently I can't laugh into this or snort or whatever I'm doing. Now, what if I started this way? You know, David, there's something that's really bothering me, but never mind. You probably won't listen to me. Perhaps David might say, what? What are you talking about? They say, well, you don't usually listen when I offer you advice. So maybe it's just better for me to keep it to myself just to preserve our relationship. And so he says, really, no, tell me what are you talking about? What advice have you given me and are you trying to give me? If I then begin to say, it really bothers me that you go over the speed limit, I probably stand a better chance of him at least hearing what I have to say and not immediately dismissing this, right? Why? Because what I've done is I've started the conversation not by telling him what I don't like about him. I've started by saying, I have noticed a flaw in your character, namely that you don't listen. Not that I hate your driving habits, but that you don't listen. This is a much bigger issue than just driving habits, right? And so when he hears the advice I have to give him, he's much more prone to think, I need to keep an open mind to prove to him that I can listen. right? And so he might actually listen to what I have to say before he just outright rejects it, which he might still do, right? I think this is what Moses is trying to accomplish as he frames this story with the commissioning of Joshua. Well, you guys really needed another leader because apparently you couldn't follow me. But that's probably not what's going on, right? I mean, you guys are really good people, right? No, you're not. So now I want you to hear all these rules and reflect on how ridiculous it is that you need a new leader to go into the land. Is that really going to solve your problems? He frames the Torah that is speaking against Israel by saying, can you respond to anything that I tell you? Are you capable of hearing anything I say to you? I think that's a pretty intuitive way to get people to listen to what you have to say. And I think this is what Deuteronomy is crafted to communicate to Israel from generation to generation. As you read this book, remember who you are. You are a stubborn and rebellious people, and you're probably not going to listen to anything it has to say. You ready to listen? Maybe a little bit more so than before. But remember, I started this by saying, what does this have to do with us? And I'm still talking about Israel. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we do not need to sing this song to ourselves as we read and hear these words of instruction. In fact, if we say that we don't need it, we likely really, really need it because we're running from the truth that these words are trying to express to us. God's word is sharper than a two-edged sword, Hebrews 4:12 tells us, dividing soul and spirit. Can you do that? Joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. I think this is what Moses has in mind as he composes this song. These words are meant to cut you to the core, to really question whether or not you can even hear what God is saying to you. Are you capable? And so I call you to think about how your attitudes toward the law, the instruction, not just Deuteronomy, but Genesis through Deuteronomy, began, and how they have ended. Does the song of stubbornness convict you? If so, how do you respond to it? Do you say in your heart, I don't need this. I just pick the truth that I like. Or do you say in your heart, I really don't understand this truth and what it's trying to say to me, but I hope one day I can. If we are to be a community that is dedicated to faithfulness, discipleship, and hospitality, this dedicated to this purpose of sending disciple-making communities into the world, then I think we have to express these values in our openness to truth, whether that truth condemns or vindicates us. We always want it to be the latter, but it's often the former.